Hello, hello, everybody. We're so happy to see you. We will give it another 2 seconds or so before we start. Exciting times here at MedTech Innovator, and we've got a great discussion lined up for today. All right. Well, it is 1 minute over the hour, and that is an excellent time to jump in and get going. Hello, I'm Diane Buis here at MedTech Innovator, where I'm director of the US program. And welcome, everybody, to MedTech Innovator Live number 11. In the 2023 series of our weekly webinars that we do as part of the Accelerator program that runs for 4 months. We're getting towards the end of it. It's exciting as an opportunity for our cohort companies to learn from experts all across the ecosystem. And for those joining us on the live stream, MedTech Innovator is the largest accelerator for medical devices, healthcare IT, and diagnostics in the world. And we're a downstream accelerator, which means that we're not looking for people with ideas, but for people who have companies that are up and running with teams and prototypes and early evidence that the technology works. And then we partner them with experts in the industry. We've got 2 of them on the call here to really help them bring that product as quickly and efficiently to the market with as much value as possible. And we're opening up these webinars to the broader ecosystem beyond our cohort. So if you're on that live stream and you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section, either on LinkedIn or YouTube. And if they're pertinent to the part we are in the discussion, we'll make sure to ask our panelists. Cohort, there'll be a private Q&A at the end of the public session, so please hang on. But feel free to start queuing up your questions for our panelists today. And so today, we are talking about healthcare engineering, manufacturing, and supply chain. It's a really important topic for anyone with a device. And we've got 2 great panelists to talk about these topics with you today. We've got Jason Meridew with Zimmer Biomet and Jim Warren with Jabil. And I will give both of them an opportunity in that order to introduce themselves and their work before we jump into the topics. And so, Jason, floor is yours. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Yeah, happy to join this conversation. So again, Jason Meridew from Zimmer Biomet. I'm currently lead our integration management office at Zimmer Biomet. I've spent actually the majority of my career, my 24-year career, with 19 years being in product development. So I've led various groups and been part of various groups within Zimmer Biomet, from biomaterials to led the sports medicine division within Zimmer Biomet in terms of product development. And most recently have been involved in our M&A group and really close to a lot of medtech startup companies in terms of integrating them when we acquire those companies into our organization. So I've kind of seen these startup acquisitions through a slightly different lens, but I'm very familiar with the R&D process as we walk through it here at a larger company, and happy to share kind of my experience and my perspective, both from the acquisition side as well as my R&D experience within the organization. And for those who don't know, Zimmer Biomet, we're a large multinational $7 billion company focused on primarily orthopedics. So total hips, total knees are really our primary business, but we also branch out into other spaces such as sports medicine, surgical products, foot and ankle products. So really joint implants and soft tissue implants are our primary business, but certainly looking to branch out beyond that as we go forward.
Fantastic. Handing it over to you, Jim, to talk a little bit about yourself and Jabil.
Sure. Thank you, Diane. So I work for Jabil, which we get that name by just putting James and Bill together, as I've said dozens of times on these calls, but it's always fun to remember. And for the first time, I'm actually in a Jabil facility. I used to do these from home. I'm actually in the heart of where Jabil started over 50 years ago here in Michigan. Jabil is the largest medical device manufacturer in the world, and that's just a small part of what we do of the $35 billion that we have as a company. We have a lot of other groups, but I'm in the Aesthetics Technology Group as a business unit director. Been with Jabil for 25 years, just crossed over 25 years last Friday. During that time, roles in operations, supply chain primarily, also quality, but now I lead the business unit. And in that role, we go off and we have customers that come in and we quote and we execute and we drive them to scale. And so I'm happy to be here, always excited. These are always fun calls, so I look forward to these each year when y'all get to invite me. So thanks for having me, Diane.
Well, thanks for being here. We're so glad you're both here. And so I think just to level set as a good start of the discussion, how do each of your organizations engage with startups? How do you work with outside entities? Of course, there's a lot of internal innovation, but I'd love to just hear a little bit before we dive deeper into the nitty-gritty. And Jim, maybe I'll stay with you first.
Sure. And I mentioned I'm in a factory, so I keep going on mute because I've got a big glass window and it looks right out on the production facility. So if I'm hanging up every once in a while, it's just me trying to find the mute button. As I mentioned, Jabil's about $35 billion. And so, yeah, you kind of guess, where do startups fit in that? What's the opportunity for a startup with Jabil? We asked ourselves that question a long time ago, and that's where we got involved with MedTech Innovator. We don't want to close the door off and say, no, you're not big enough yet for a Jabil. In fact, we want to teach folks the lessons learned from times when we've brought scaled companies into Jabil and thought, here's 5 or 6 things that we think you could have done differently a long time ago. So the way we go about that is engaging in MedTech Innovator and mentoring and being there to talk about some of the challenges that we see, even scaled companies, even large OEMs that are producing with us today. So that's where we see our involvement. I'm always open when I start mentoring folks that Jabil doesn't invest. We don't have a CVC. We're not out there giving cash, but we feel we invest with our time and our willingness to work with startups and kind of help educate them. And we're doing that again this year. We've got a couple of mentorships that are underway where we feel that engagement, we're giving back to the medical industry. We're getting folks ready. We know the industry, that once you're in it, you kind of stay in it. So maybe you're doing a startup now, maybe you get acquired, maybe you move to a different company. One thing we want to do is to make sure you're familiar with what Jabil is, what we do, and what we can do ultimately for you. So thank you.
Appreciate that, and I'll ask you the same question, Jason. How does Zimmer Biomet and how do you engage with outside innovators?
Yeah, great question. I think so first of all, we're relatively new to the engagement with the MedTech Innovator space. This has really been our first year being involved with the program and really excited to be part of it. I think we're obviously involved in the mentor program, mentoring a few companies right now. But really a lot of our interaction with kind of these early startups in the medtech space is on the acquisition side. So we're continually looking for, smaller organizations that have interesting technologies that we can fold into our organization and help grow with those technologies. So our business we're in a bit of a transition period where we're, as an organization, really trying to kind of overhaul our portfolio and diversify into spaces that aren't truly just pure orthopedics. So we're continually looking for acquisitions. We've been very active over the last 2 years, 3 years in acquiring startups in this med device space, and are continually interacting, looking at, evaluating, speaking to startups. But always with our partnership and involvement in the MedTech Innovator process and organization, we're somewhat new to that, but excited to be part of it and kind of build some more relationships in those startups.
Fantastic, appreciate that. And we're very glad to have both of your organizations as partners and to work with you, and that you're working with the cohort. As we're going into our topic for the day, right? Engineering, manufacturing, supply chain. We look at large companies and small companies in slightly different ways, and I'd like perhaps for you, Jason, to comment on the fact you're with Zimmer Biomet, very large organization. The amount of scrutiny one is under when bringing a product to market might be different. And I'd love to hear your reflection on that.
Yeah, certainly have had a lot of experience kind of seeing the difference between kind of how startups treat some some of the processes, and whether it be end of line processes or with being cleaning, packaging, sterilization, and how larger multinationals. I think the FDA certainly spends a lot of time with us in our space, and just because of our scale and our breadth of products. So they spend a lot of time with us trying to make sure that we have a very robust and implement patient safety at our highest standard. Certainly that creates an environment where we have requirements that are and sometimes can be viewed as difficult to meet. And that may be a slightly different lens than what medtech startups are looking at in terms of getting products to market. So certainly as each of you from a startup space may want to think about kind of a multi-lens approach to your portfolio and your product development process, obviously getting to market and having that initial launch is likely a big priority initially, and certainly there may be some requirements that may be looked at with a slightly different lens when you look to try to prioritize that commercial launch versus what maybe something for a potential acquisition may be looking for. So it's just something to keep in mind. I think we as a multi national are looking for highly detailed processes, automated processes, whereas startups in commercial with early commercial launches maybe can not have those requirements in place necessarily. So just something to think about where you're at in your life cycle. Those requirements may be changing. If it's coming to market, you certainly can likely save some money in some places, but as you look to get acquired by a larger multinational, those requirements may change a little bit. Certainly, as we try to value companies, additional costs for redoing validation work or redoing manufacturing process validation work oftentimes is built into our deal model and hurts the valuation of companies as we look to acquire. So just something to think about as you look down the longer lens of the life of your company and your products.
Jim, is there something you'd like to follow up on that in terms of what to do now with an eye towards the future? So the difference in terms of company stage, are you looking to get to market as fast as possible, where you might be able to cut a corner or two, or are you looking to get acquired when the level of scrutiny might be at the level of Zimmer Biomet?
I think Jason said it all, and he said it really well. I think what's most important to remember is that at the end of every one of these devices is a patient, and that patient could be your mom, it could be your brother, it could be a cousin. You have to have a sense of behavioral based quality. Everything that you're doing to that product should have a basis in quality, and you should be focused on that and know that ultimately someone you love could be using that device. I think if you build that culture into your company, you can't lose. And yeah, sometimes it's rigorous, sometimes it's tough, but it's worth doing. That's why you're in this industry. If it wasn't, you'd be off doing something else.
I appreciate that. I think that is spot on. So let's talk about product design and development. So when you're developing a product, and especially at the early stages, right? You have to get ready for manufacturing at some point. What are some of the things that to keep in mind to prevent later costly mistakes as well as refactoring? So designing with manufacturing in mind, what are some of the problems and challenges that you see?
Maybe I'll touch on this one first. Certainly one of the things that I think about as I've learned over my career is thinking about the materials and ultimately sterilization and cleaning processes down the line. I think it's certainly a big focus of early development is obviously device functionality, making sure device X has, cool features and does the thing it's intended to do. However, I think, oftentimes maybe it's glossed over slightly are, what are the end materials? Do those materials have a shelf life that's going to be acceptable for the end product? Are they compatible with my sterilization method that I plan to use? Have I designed my device in a way that can fit within existing packaging that maybe has already been validated? So a lot of times in my experience, all the fun development stuff is kind of that front end piece where I get it, engineers get to design and think about helping patients, but it's maybe the less sexy piece of development that probably takes equally as long, in my experience, to think about in terms of choosing the right materials, choosing, materials that can have, shelf life that'll meet your standards, having materials that'll meet a sterilization requirement. So it's that kind of that back end piece of design for manufacturing that I think often is underestimated, but is equally important in my experience.
I do want to come back to that, but Jim, what do you see?
I see that. It's interesting. So when we think about mechanical aspects of it versus electronics, so when you have something in like really cool, one of the challenges with really cool is sometimes you don't have a whole lot of opportunities to get test access to that cool product that you created that looks really slick. So you have to have that balance between your plan to brand language, your ethos of design, and the ability to test. And then also sometimes these things that look really cool, they're great to produce for 10 to 100, but now you've got to scale it to 1,000. And that's where it gets tough, because in the world of prototyping, and Elon said this multiple times, it's easy to do 1 or 2, but now you got to do 1,000, you got to do 10,000, you got to do 1,000,000. So I think that early on, you have to have that mind around design for automation, design for test, and ultimately design for supply chain. Because if you can't get all those cool parts that you spec'd in, then you aren't going to be able to sell that cool product that you're planning to get out there.
That is helpful. And so if we're going to look into making sure that we can manufacture and source, traceability is one of the topics that comes up time and again. And so I'm curious to hear whether you might have some examples or best practices for managing that traceability, right? It's just like you just said, it's a cool piece. Okay, where is it coming from? Can we make sure it's always coming from there in that same level of quality? So systems engineering, documentation, traceability. How do we work with those in a development project? Happy to leave it open to either of you.
I can refer to Jason, because really traceability for me comes from a manufacturing perspective. If you tell me you had a problem with a specific lot code of a capacitor, I can tell you every single product that we built for you and where it is in the world based on where your serial numbers went off and shipped to. But I think at the documentation level, that's probably something maybe I could lean on Jason for that answer.
Yeah, I can certainly share my experience. I think very similar to your answer, Jim. I think ultimately we rely heavily on our suppliers that we work with, or I should say, when I've worked in terms of the acquisitions that we've done, those targets have had suppliers that have basically built into their process the traceability that's necessary. I think ultimately, I don't have a ton of experience in terms of knowing the systems that are used for traceability, but I do know it's certainly a big part of what we kind of a must-have in terms of being a target for acquisition, in terms of having device traceability all the way back to the raw material state is something that's a must-have from us as you look to exit to a potential acquisition. So I don't have Diane, I apologize, but I don't have a tremendous amount of experience in terms of software packages or additional technical background on ways to do that. Apologies on that.
Oh, not at all. That's why we do different webinars on different things.
Yeah.
And so I poke at a couple of topics, and to me, that's interesting to hear. I think it's interesting for the cohort to hear too. Talk to the right person about the right thing, and also be transparent about what you're an expert at and what you're not. I think that is critical as well. So all good things. One of the more fun questions I got from our cohort in the run up to this is, which one is worse? feature creep or a half-baked product development, right? You're balancing two things, and we're still in the early, and we'll get into the later phases in a minute, but in the early phases of product design and development, those are tricky questions. And so I'm staying at the early phase for a second, putting that in front of you. Feature creep or half-baked?
In my opinion, half-baked is worse. And I think I go back to Jim's comments on kind of patient safety and ultimately thinking about what's, we're in the med device industry. All of us are making products that are going to go into potentially a family member, people that we're going to be trying to help. And ultimately, if a device is, in terms of my perspective, if we're designing a device that's potentially half-baked from a development standpoint, you're potentially putting patients at risk, and that's, I think, should be our primary objective here is do no harm, very similar to the Hippocratic Oath. But so that's probably my perspective. I think feature creep is certainly something to watch out for, and can become problematic. But I think ultimately having a fully baked product that's robust, do no harm to patients, and really a safe and effective product that you feel confident is going to help the patient long run.
Great. Appreciate that. Jim?
Agree. Obviously Zimmer Bio they're the experts, right? So you're gonna default to them when they say something like that. I'm just here. I'm here baking the cake once it's decided. There's always going to be scope creep. That's always going to happen in feature creep. It's going to happen. We're innovative folks. We look at something, we take in information, whether it's through our environment or other products that we see, and we go, oh, that'd be nice to have. I want to do that. I want to do that. And then ultimately you hire somebody in marketing, and that's their job, is to help you creep into the next thing. So it's always going to be there. But really, as to Jason's point, we got to have that safety and security to the patient. And you don't get that with a half-baked device. Fair
points. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the next step, right? Development partnerships. So I think as startups, one of the most critical questions you always have to ask yourself, and so it comes up in many of the webinars for different reasons, is how much in-house, how much external consultants, right? As a startup, you're running on a lean budget. Do you hire someone or do you bring in an external consultant? And so specifically for the development process, right? Which parts should you always do in-house? Where should you outsource? Where should you bring in external consultants?
I can certainly go first on this one. I mean, I think it depends on the company, from the startup company in terms of its makeup and expertise within. I think we can all recognize that each of us, as sitting in each of your shoes as a key member of your team or your organization, have some expertise. And oftentimes, those are in the R&D spaces. Those are maybe marketing folks or sales folks. I think those are the spaces that ultimately you try to keep in-house as much as you can. I think engineers have the tendency to be able to span, wear multiple hats, whether it be kind of manufacturing, quality. I see that oftentimes being maintained in-house. I think where I've seen companies be most successful is where they go outside for potentially getting assistance on regulatory approvals and scaling for manufacturing. I think those are probably the most obvious places that I've seen startups be most successful. Oftentimes, with new technologies and that haven't been seen by the regulatory bodies, it's key to pull in regulatory experts that can help craft your story. So it's going to be well received within whatever regulatory body you're trying to get in front of. Additionally, on the manufacturing side, choosing a consultant or partnering with a manufacturer that has the scalability and maybe experience with similar, whether it be electromechanical or injection molding, whatever the particular niches of your products, but having that experience and partnering with those folks can certainly, I've seen, expedite the process in getting to market.
And I think you really have to be honest with yourself and really do a strong internal assessment of what skills you have. One of the things that I see that I think is just super vital for any startup is a program manager internal, someone who's really herding those cats, who's really asking the questions, who's driving the team forward. And that's often a challenge because that's looked as somebody that, oh, they can be a program manager that also handle marketing, IT, and catering. It's like, no, you need to have that person has to be focused on the program management. They have to have alignment to the activities, and you have to count on them as a vital part of the team. What's great about that is they're the ones that can identify what other aspects that you're going to need months ahead of time. So you're not scrambling to find somebody who understands a particular type of software that you're going to have to interface with. So I think that's one of those things you don't get cheap on. You got to have a very classically trained program manager. And the beauty about that is if you get a classically trained program manager, they can interact with anyone else that has program management outside of your organization. And I think that's a great benefit because time is money. And when I see people burning cash, it's usually because they've had misplaced plans or a lack of focus. I think for me, that's a big one that I love to see is when you have a classically trained program manager involved early on.
Nice. Yeah, great shout out to the profession of program managers. I am on board. And I'm not a certified one, but it's important. It is really important. Let's talk about when. So when in the life cycle of a company is the right time to implement supplier agreements, right? So if I'm 3D printing pieces right now in my own workshop, how do I step it up, and at what point and what type of supplier agreements should I get into place? And perhaps what are the key terms? That's 5 questions. I'm going to walk it back and say when and key terms.
So supplier agreements, I love supplier agreements on the Jabil side, but also I'm kind of at a macro advantage, right? Jabil spends $25 billion a year in material spend, and you got to have those contracts. What I tell people is don't get hooked too early. You tie yourself in too early to something and it's hard to get out of it. Also, there's some tricky supplier agreements out there that'll get you in and it's tough to get out of them. So you got to be careful. You got to time it out as to when you plan for that. But most importantly, something I'm an advocate for in a component level supplier agreements is what I'm kind of aiming at the moment. It's important for me is I don't like seeing anybody putting anything on their board that they can't find on DigiKey. When you can find it on DigiKey, you know it's ultra available to everybody. You're not in some boutique environment. Now, when you get to a supplier agreement, say with like a Jabil or something like that, that's a little different. Now you're starting down the path of your scaling, you're building up. I think early on, you want to have the agreements with your suppliers that are very flexible because you are going to have to be very flexible early on. You're going to have a certain amount of cash. You're going to have a certain amount of scope. And you really want to know what you're getting tied into so you don't get anchored into a position that you can't get out of. That's why it's important to have a good person that you can lean on from a legal perspective to understand what you're signing. Don't just sign something just so you can get in. If you don't understand what you're signing, don't sign it. But again, have that forward-looking plan that you will get legal advice. You will understand those contracts, those supplier agreements, and then ask those questions. That's one of the things in the mentors that I've had them send over before. I look them over and I go, well, here's 10 things that I don't understand, and I'm looking at these contracts all the time. So I would feedback, go off and dig in a little bit more with a real legal person as to what these mean. But know what you're signing, know what you're getting involved in. You might run across a great deal, but find out, make sure that that's what you're getting and that it's not just you're guessing that you're in a good position.
Yeah, I think Jim hit the nail on the head when he said flexibility. I think for folks in your shoes, the assumption is many of you are looking at an exit at some point where you're looking to be acquired by a larger organization, and the more you kind of tie yourself to a very strict agreement terms, supplier terms, those become problematic from an acquisition standpoint and exit standpoint. I think the more you can build in flexibility that still keep your costs at an acceptable level, ultimately, when you are acquired and volume scale up dramatically and you have a large multinational that has some leverage with suppliers, that's when I think the supply agreements become more important. But I think, ultimately you certainly want to secure, make sure you have, a consistent supply. But I think pricing, I wouldn't be too focused, at least in the what I call the midterm of your process, with ultimately pricing being the highest focus. I think, certainly being cognizant of choosing a supplier that you're confident in, that you've evaluated, you've spent time with, you've visited multiple times, are confident in their capabilities, is probably something that I've seen in the past, many startups maybe don't spend enough time on. And certainly something I would recommend is spending, maybe spending more time on evaluating those suppliers, because you're going to be linked to the hip for quite some time, and shifting from supplier to supplier is not something you want to do. It's going to derail your whole development and manufacturing timeline. So, spending time on your due diligence with your suppliers, visiting them, having, talking to other customers that utilize them, I think is really important. But then ultimately, when you get to those supply agreements, having flexibility, as Jim mentioned, you don't necessarily, you don't want to have the most difficult to back out of terms, because ultimately, if you get to a point of exit or a point of acquisition, in all likelihood, your acquirer is going to be trying to renegotiate most of those supply agreements.
Both of you touched on two things that I want to follow up on both, and that is flexibility as well as diligence in terms of your supplier. So I'll start with the flexibility piece, and that is Jason, you just mentioned flexibility. Jim, you said if your piece is basically not universally available, think about it differently. So I think the question I want to ask here is off the shelf versus custom. And so how do I balance, many medical devices are, especially the higher class ones, implantables, small is king, but small also means every little corner matters. And so we are balancing very heavily the custom versus off the shelf that anyone can make, and that flexibility. I'd like both of you to talk a little bit about that dichotomy, and be that for implantables, but more broadly across the industry. How do I choose whether to do something that is specific to my device versus something that anyone can build so that I retain that flexibility?
I have a habit of speaking about electronics because that's what I do. So when I talk about custom versus common, a lot of times I'm talking about the electronics industry, and it does hold up. So you have ASICs out there that could be 24-week lead time. Sure, you can be lazy and throw that on a board because it'll do everything and then some. But if you put the time in and you go with, say, a few microprocessors, a few caps, resistors, a crystal for your clock, you can spend that money that you're saving on that ridiculously expensive ASIC on other things. And so I think you just don't get lazy and just assume that someone else can do it for you. And they will. You'll have field service engineers from large companies that can come in and do your whole board work for you as long as you use that one chip. Don't get lazy. You spend your money and save your money for when you need to spend it. So don't go custom too early. Figure out exactly how far you can take it with common ingredients before you go to something super special. Now, it's not saying that you won't have to go to something super special. You may have to, but when you do, you've got that money to be able to invest.
Yeah, and I'll maybe touch on the point that Jim mentioned there with the cost piece, right? I think it's important to consider the end level device cost, right? Ultimately, you maybe can spend a little bit more on a off the shelf item if your end device isn't that cost sensitive in terms of you've got good margins between your cost of goods and your ASP. So I think ultimately there's probably a number of factors that probably go into this decision, whether it be ultimate cost of goods you're looking to achieve for your end device versus how quickly I want to get to market and the cost of designing something custom. So I think in many cases there's a multi-factor decision that has to be weighed to what's more important, a cost of goods, a time to market, that really has to be weighed in terms of choosing an off-the-shelf item versus a custom device. I can tell you, certainly the other piece of it with off the shelf items is having a dual supplier. I think, ultimately many of you are going to be a small fish in a big pond with respect to choosing, getting supply of off the shelf products. I've certainly seen instances where we've had a single source or of particular items, and that single source has dried up, and we've been left in the lurch without a secondary supplier. So as you think about those off the shelf items, it's good to always think in the background, what's my secondary supplier? Because in all likelihood, you're not going to have the leverage to get the first shot at the products if it's coming from a large manufacturer.
Appreciate that, and that was definitely one of the things I wanted to tee up, that redundancy, right? Several manufacturers before I go on with that redundancy, or having at least a second manufacturer. I'd like to come back to the previous point of that of diligence. What should you be asking? And Jason, you already answered some of that in your previous comments, but I wanted to drill a little bit deeper on what questions should I ask? What is the diligence that I need to do as a startup to really understand, is this the right manufacturer for my device at this point in time? And until when? So should I right now be looking for someone who can make hundreds of, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands? Do I need one for a small run? But also, what are the questions I should ask?
Yeah, certainly. I think it depends on the life cycle of your development process. I think ultimately we all recognize that on the early stages, agility is important, right? You want to maybe choose a prototype house that can create quickly iterations to help accelerate your product development process. Ultimately, I think it's dependent on each type of device, or maybe each organization, to decide, okay, we've gotten to a design freeze that we're very confident in, and that's probably when the diligence of true scalable manufacturing, in my opinion, needs to begin. And in that case, there's a multi-factored approach that I would recommend. Ultimately, you're going to want to consider suppliers that have specialties that align with what your product needs. I think a scale that is big enough that can sustain a pretty substantial ramp up if you're expecting an exit with an acquisition. I think visiting suppliers multiple times to get a good feeling for if they're going to be able to meet the standards that you are going to require. I think a big piece, and Jim mentioned one of his other questions, is automation. We look for suppliers that can automate as much as possible. When you're doing manual processes, that becomes problematic from a quality control standpoint, from a repeatability standpoint. I've certainly seen a number of acquisitions that we've done where maybe a target has used a much smaller supplier in terms of scale that does a lot of manual processing. And what that does is it ultimately causes us to have to look to transfer the product to another supplier post-acquisition, delays growth of the portfolio or the product. So certainly something to think about is trying to minimize manual processes as you evaluate suppliers, but also visiting them often, talking to other customers that utilize them. This is probably one of the most important decisions you'll make as a startup is choosing the right suppliers that fit the type of product and growth objectives you have. So a huge decision as part of your process.
Yeah, big one, Jason, you mentioned is references. So find people that are already using that manufacturer. Sometimes they'll offer them up. Other times you'll find them through your own network. But that's really the best, is the voice of the customer, right? So what are they seeing? What sort of KPIs are being driven? What sort of shop level controls? when they have had an issue, how was it handled? How fast did they react? Those are the things that you're going to see the sort of intangibles that you're not going to find in a presentation that are important to you. And it is the biggest decision, because now you're putting your future in the hands of somebody else, and you're not necessarily on the steering wheel there. So that's a big one. But it's a great opportunity to start scaling with the right customer, right supplier, right partner. And I really do think at that point, they have to be a partner. They can't just be a supplier. And so how do you build that relationship? How do you make sure that it's open and honest and transparent? You got to ask a lot of questions. You got to dig in on that. And I think references are a huge way to do that.
Appreciate those comments. I think these are some of the things even in conversations with a cohort that I hear. So that's great, and that's also why having a group of fellow CEOs that you can ask, hey, who have you been working with, and what has been your experience? The MTI alumni as well as the current cohort members, that matters. So appreciate the point to references. One of the questions that is coming up more and more often is, in years past, we would talk about offshoring. At this point in time, we're more often talking about nearshoring. And so when we're talking about portfolio of partnerships, when we're talking about manufacturing partnerships, what do you see and hear? Advantages and disadvantages? What are the trends you're seeing in terms of, I want one manufacturer far away and one close by? What do you see?
Well, it's interesting because in the Jabil world, we're still seeing offshoring. A lot of times when you're going for scale, you're going for a lower cost. But what's been more interesting is I've seen less companies that are more interested in splitting their production between Jabil and somebody else. And, they always have the concept of, you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket. And our argument is, well, if the basket's really awesome, you probably do. So we have those kind of checks and balances internally that allow us to take a customer's entire portfolio and they feel comfortable having it all in one location, knowing that if something happens, we can move it quickly. So we're not seeing necessarily the onshoring. I do see where customers are not as quick to say, let's go to Asia or let's go offshore. There's kind of a slower discussion around how does that phase in time? Could we start here and move it? And that's great, because it means there's a level of patience there. There's also, I think, over time, people have learned that the other places get expensive. China has gotten much more expensive over the last 20 years to where nowadays it's not, hey, I'm going to go there and save 50%. Yes, you are going to save some money in some cases. And primarily where we see those savings nowadays are in tariffs, where if you're building there, you're not going to have to pay that tariff of shipping from the US. Now, the cool thing is you can offset those tariffs by manufacturing in Mexico in a lot of cases and shipping from there. So I think people are getting smarter about that and realizing that just to go to a low-cost region doesn't automatically ensure that you're going to save money. In some cases, in the taxes and other things, you're going to have a challenge there. So you do have to kind of take the time to really understand your roadmap, your plan. But also one thing I tell my customers is that if I'm moving a product from the US to Asia, I don't like to jump right away to Asia. I like to go to Mexico. And the reason I do that is because there's a Jabil facility there that I use that learns the product. We work in a similar time zone as our customers. So we're not burning our customer out. The customer's not having to travel to Asia. They're going down to Mexico. It's a shorter trip. Saves them a little bit of money. Then ultimately, once I lock that process down there and we determine that we're either going to offshore it to Asia or we're going to split that, we'll bring our folks from Asia over, and it's a copy paste for us because all of our facilities are basically the same. But I think that education has gone far and wide to the point where people are making better decisions about when to move, where to move, and how to move.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with Jim. I think at Zimmer Biomet, we've probably slowed a little bit in terms of offshoring over the last 10 years, but it's still a viable option. We've got a number of programs that are going to, whether it be China or Mexico. So I certainly see, as Jim mentioned, the cost advantage is not as significant, but I think there is some money to be made there, or saved, I guess I should say, in terms of offshoring, when the particular example requires it. So yeah, I think it's still a viable option. It just depends on the product. And I think people are more realistic about, as Jim mentioned, being close and kind of local, somewhat local, to be able to visit the manufacturing site regularly. Going to China adds complexity. So if, as device complexity increases, risks increase as you offshore a little bit. So I think organizations are becoming smarter about how they evaluate other factors besides just cost, because that cost advantage has shrunk over the last 10 years.
That's helpful. And so when I'd like to take us all the way to, design transfer. So how, as we're talking about, well, I mean, we're talking about design transfer, we're talking about manufacturing, cost reduction. Both of you tipped on it, just because that is one of the reasons people offshore. What other considerations are there when we're talking about going to scale that people should pay attention to? So how, when going from my small runs to larger runs, what cost reduction measures do you usually employ?
So one of the funny ones, and this is relevant nowadays, is the Fed continues to raise the rate. You're tying up inventory when you have a part that has a long lead time because you want to secure it. As Jason mentioned earlier, you want to have options. So when you have an approved vendor list, you want to have at least 2 or 3 options on that list of who you can go to. And usually the more the better, because that means it's standard off the shelf. And when you do that, you're not tying up your cash in inventory positions, which is extremely important. Also, when you have multiple suppliers, there's an opportunity for competition. And with that competition, you can drive that cost position down. And then also, as Jason mentioned, you have a well thought out design usually allows for Lean Six Sigma efforts that you can look towards automation planning. Maybe it's semi-automated initially for maybe very specific items, or it's full automation long ways down the road. Which, if you're looking to be acquired and someone has that kind of money to go a full automation platform and you're set up for that, I think that's a huge benefit. But early on, just making sure that your product, it can go down the line with minimal scrap. That's another area that a lot of people don't consider, where they think that they're just gonna run and it's gonna be fine. And even that scrap goes to how do you design your tooling. So a lot of times we talk about hot runner and cold runner. Hot runners are great for reducing the amount of scrap in molding, and the scrap that I'm talking about is kind of the leftover pieces that run through the routes in the mold themselves. So there's little things like that as you move towards scale. Family tooling, not a big fan of it. It works for some people, but I do like multi cavities when it makes sense. So there's a lot of little things that you can start to twist and tweak, but the big one for me is not tying up your cash in places where if you were just a little bit more, you drive a little bit more ingenuity, you could avoid that.
Yeah, great, Jim. One other thing came to my mind was we've seen in instances where packaging can be, if you can choose an off-the-shelf packaging configuration, that can, significantly change your cost profile from a packaging perspective, cut your packaging costs in half. So and it kind of goes back to your device design somewhat in terms of designing a device that can fit within an existing packaging envelope, whether it be a sterile peelable tray or a pouch that exists today. Those are things that definitely consider as you're thinking, if your end device is going to be a package sterile. Certainly thinking about what that packaging is going to look like, begin to talk to packaging suppliers and begin to think about the footprint of your final device and how that fits into an existing packaging. Because if you go down the road of having to design a custom package, your cost of goods go up pretty significantly, probably in a matter of multiple just on your packaging piece. So just another thing to think about there.
I appreciate both of you bringing up scrap and packaging. Those are the types of things that we talk about later in the process, right? As we're really fine-tuning the manufacturing and taking some of the costs out. I'd like to stay on the later pieces, that end of the line part. And Jason, I know that in our pre-call you specifically brought up the packaging, the sterilization, some of the things that one may not think about at the beginning of the journey, right? As in, hey, I'm trying to make a device, I'm just going to get it manufactured. But yes, en route to bringing a product to market, that is an important consideration. I'd love for you to kind of just share a couple of thoughts on that. Where do you see things go wrong? What's important to pay attention to in that context?
Yeah, it's a big part of what we see in terms of evaluating startups is maybe kind of glossing over some of the more robust validations of end of line processes. And as you mentioned, that we consider end of line packaging, sterilization, cleaning. And if I could just touch on cleaning, for instance, many of our devices are implantables, or they're surgical instruments that go inside the body. So device cleanliness is certainly a big part of kind of our requirements. I think many smaller organizations are looking and evaluating suppliers that can provide a device and maybe haven't thought through a full automated cleaning process, which is something that's really a must-have for us at Zimmer Biomet, in terms of having a process that is essentially hands-off from a person touch standpoint. Cleaning in terms of having a multi-stage cleaning process that happens automatically at a supplier is a big piece of what we look for and prefer to see as opposed to some type of manual cleaning process. The same can be true for packaging as well. Having an automated packaging line. With these end of line processes, the FDA certainly focuses on those when they come in to visit Zimmer Biomet. They want to see, as automation. They want to see, no variability between cleaning and packaging and sterilization. So the more effort you put into whether it be, the cleaning process, sterilization process, packaging process, those are dollars that are well spent, in my opinion, because it's going to make you far more attractive as a target for exit down the line. And probably the most frequent thing that we see when we make our acquisitions is having to spend significant dollars in those spaces, kind of bringing up to, improving the level of control with those types of things.
Jim, anything to add on that front?
Yeah, so one of the things that it's funny, one of the early indications of what kind of product you're dealing with and what level of engineering that product has been through is something like the number of different screws that are used. Did they consolidate down to 2 or 3 types? Did they consolidate down to the same type of adhesive or RTV material across the unit? And I think when you start to see that the answer is yes in those cases, you realize you're dealing with a well-engineered device, that's something that's probably been well thought out and planned out. And so those are cool things to see early on that then lead to a product that has limited variation. And that is something, as Jason mentioned, is extremely important. The less variation you have, the better consistent result you're going to see, and the ease of scalability will be there.
Thanks for that. So when we talk about packaging, I think the next thing that comes up immediately in my mind is shelf life. Right now we've built something, we've packaged it. Shelf life is also something that gets lost at the beginning of a process. What can you tell us about how to extend the shelf life? What to think about early when we're talking about shelf life?
Yeah, for me, it's the right materials. I think choosing the materials that you, and there's a lot of information available from material suppliers in terms of if there's a predecessor for shelf life, but ultimately I think many of us in this med device space have experience with accelerated aging on certain materials. Obviously, if you can choose devices that are acceptable to an accelerated aging process, that is a big win, but there's certain limitations there in terms of available materials. But in terms of thinking about that, it's not always, I think oftentimes when we talk to maybe injection molders or material suppliers, they maybe want to push you in a certain direction based on what materials they're familiar with, or maybe what materials are the newest and fanciest. But ultimately, I think thinking more about how am I going to get to an acceptable shelf life for our device that maybe will, minimize our scrap costs. I think that's one thing that I've seen on some recent acquisitions where a target company had a device that had a 6-month shelf life. And ultimately the scrap cost and inventory costs were pretty significant for that deal, just because we had to, obviously a short turnaround in terms of how long those products are available. So, the more time that can be spent picking a material that you are confident you'll be able to either have a real-time shelf life data on or ability to do some accelerated aging on, I think will be a big win and certainly look good in terms of minimizing those scrap costs.
And I would just add, for that side of it, extremely important. I think also understanding and fully investigating your forecast and not being overly optimistic of how much you're going to make, because a lot of that could just end up on the shelf and it'll just sit there and burn out. So digging in early, being cautiously optimistic, not being too pessimistic either, because if you don't have enough to sell, then you lose that position. But I think a lot of times we overestimate how much of an opportunity we're really going to have. And again, this comes back to inventories, basically cash sitting somewhere where it can't be spent elsewhere. And the worst thing that could happen to that cash that's tied up on a shelf is that it goes in the trash. So really having that focus early on for the types of materials and extending the shelf life, but also really understanding your forecast of what you should be putting out there, and that time to turn, that time to sit, being cognizant of that is extremely important.
I hear you on that one. And looking at the time, I want to make sure I ask one more question regarding supply chain flexibility. I think I said we were going to talk about supply chains, and we did a little bit. How easy or hard is it to change a process once you've established it? And if you have examples, I think that's something. Basically, how much am I set in stone when I make these choices now?
From a component level, often it's something that if you have a like for like, it's pretty easy to make that transition. When it comes to a supplier itself, you're looking at a significant amount of time when you look at product validation. And a lot of times people think it's easy. The consumer world, it is. You can change things, you can move lines around. But once you have a fully validated line and you've gone through the IQ, OQ, PQ process and you've locked down, moving just one piece of equipment. So say you have an automation piece that breaks down. We'll just put a new one back in. Yeah, you will, but you're going to have to revalidate the whole line and go through that process again. So you have to think about those things up front. That's why a lot of times in the tooling world, we do spare parts. We have those spare cores and whatnot that we can pull out and put in, and they're validated already. So you don't have to stop. And then if you do decide, I don't like this supplier anymore, I'm going down the street. Okay, well, down the street, you're going to have to revalidate, which means the current manufacturer you have is going to have to build up a buffer for you so that you've got product to sell to fund that validation that you're going to have going down the street. So there's planned flexibility. There's an opportunity to be flexible, but you have to be honest with yourself early on. Exactly what are you expecting from your supplier? And that's why Jason and I say it's really important to work through that level of partnership and understand who you're going to start working with and making sure there's a long term. Because in the world of healthcare and medical, it is not easy just to say, I'm out, I'm going down the street. Not so.
100% agree. I think if I had to put a kind of time frame for us, it's probably 12 to 18 months to change suppliers that does a kind of a full line product from a process standpoint. So yeah, certainly not easy change, and that Jim hit the nail on the head that choosing the right supplier is really important. Yeah, because the change is not easy, and it's lengthy and it's costly. So you just got to be cognizant of that.
And with that, we are almost on top of the hour. Time flies when we're having fun. I want to thank our two panelists before we bid our online audience goodbye. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you to Jason Meridew from Zimmer Biomet and Jim Warren of Jabil. We'll end the live stream here. Please come back or watch the other videos. Pleasure having you. To our online audience, have a great day. To our cohort, please stick around.